People who've gotten their bosses fired. How? The CEO publicly praised me for completing a task that my boss had struggled with, so my boss retaliated by forwarding all of his tasks to me in an effort to overwhelm me with work. I actually found his job pretty manageable, which the CEO also noticed and fired him, giving me his job and office. He grabbed the back of my neck and said, "If you ever say I'm wrong in front of a customer again, I will beat your ass." I went to the GM and told him, and my supervisor was relieved of his duties about 5 minutes later. It was my supervisor. It got to the point that I had decided to quit. I had my resignation letter in my purse, but decided to let his boss know why I was quitting. Supervisor would talk about all the people on our team constantly, but only behind their backs. I got so sick of telling him to cut it out. My husband and I happened to work at the same place, different departments, and my supervisor would make sexual comments about threesomes with him. Ooh, what hotel we picked for our afternoon delight, crap like that. It was so bloody uncomfortable. Apart from this, he spent most of his supervising time outside smoking. Problem was, supervisor was one of the guys, and I was the only girl. Turns out his boss was disgusted, told his boss, who lost his mind. They started an investigation which took 3 days. They interviewed staff, they corroborated what I said. They checked the security cameras, saw he was spending most of his workday outside smoking, and was fired. When he was told, he guessed, wasn't hard, that I was the person who complained and tried to get to me to apologize, that I took it the wrong way. The best feeling was my co-workers surrounding me as he was wailed out. That was a lovely ending to it all. My boss hired me at a surprisingly good salary and got me 2 raises in the first 5 years. When the work slowed down to our department, he defended all his employees to management. They fired him the same day they fired me. Was working maintenance at an ice rink. The rule for anyone who knows how an ice rink works is, if the Zamboni doors open, you get the fuck off the ice. Some dickhead decided to ignore the fact that they were open and that I was standing in the doorway, and decided to rip off one last slap shot. The puck bounced off the glass and hit me in the head. I was okay, but reported it to my boss, because we have to fill out an incident report for things like that. The boss asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "I feel okay." Then he responded with, "Well, we don't really have to report it then, do we?" I reminded him of the protocol, but it was clear he didn't want to do it. Since he wouldn't do it, I sent a descriptive email of the incident up to the administration, because I felt there should be some sort of documentation/paper trail in case, God forbid, I ended up having a brain hemorrhage or something a few days later. The boss was fired by my next shift. I was fired because I abandoned my job while on short-term disability, because while on approved leave, they are a date for me to return. Never informed me, by their own admission, and when I obviously didn't return to work, I was fired. The locker I had at work had my work boots in it that the company pays $90 a year towards. However, there isn't a pair under $100 available, so you always end up having some come out of your paycheck. At that point, they are yours regardless of the company line. They disagreed and said they were thrown out. I reported them stolen, and the HR director responsible for getting me fired was fired. Phoned him to tell him I won't be at work for the rest of the week as my mum is terminally ill in hospital. The next day, about an hour after she passed away, he phoned and asked why I wasn't at work. I just hung up on him, so I wouldn't say anything that would get me in trouble. The next day, I sent the area manager a WhatsApp message explaining what he'd be done, and attached a video of him breaking the freezer door while having a tantrum, which cost the store nearly £5,000 in lost stock and the repair costs, which he told the AM it broke on its own. He got fired that day, and I got 2 weeks off with full pay. About 13 to 14 years ago, I was working as a web designer for a .com. In our immediate group were a creative director, a creative manager, and 2 of us who were designers, and we were all part of the marketing department. The creative director was a joke, brought in by the previous VP of marketing who he was friends with. He hardly did any work himself and just played online poker waiting on us to send him things for approval. And he'd never stick around late when the rest of us needed to stay late to hit a deadline or deal with a crisis, etc. The creative manager, who'd been in charge for a couple years before the creative director's hiring, still ran the day-to-day. So the creative manager gave his notice that he'd accepted a new job, and when I met with the current VP of marketing to discuss transition, I mentioned that the creative director would need to step up and pull his weight. I guess a similar message was expressed by a number of people, and less than a week after the creative manager's last day the creative director was fired. This kind of sucked, because we went down from 4 to 2 people in our group. I was appointed acting creative manager, and we eventually did hire one more designer. I left the company a couple months later too, after the latest VP of marketing was let go, and there was going to be a 10th different person overseeing marketing in my 5 years there. And the asshole creative director? He'd reached out at some point, looking for files for his portfolio, I think, and it happened to be in the 2-week window, where I'd accepted my next job, but hadn't yet started, so I mentioned my new position. Well, he fires off a copy of his resume to the company president, and tried to poach my new job out from under me. On my first day at the new job, the president mentioned that somebody else from that same company also applied for the job and forwarded me the application email to see if I knew him. Saw that the date was after he and I had last communicated. Not my boss, but I helped my friend get her boss fired. He was a general manager and always grabbing her sides, purposely scheduling her to have shifts alone with him, asking her for nudes, asking her to sleep with him, etc. She reported it so many times to the owner, big boss, and they said they couldn't do anything because they hadn't seen it and had no their reports other than her account. So I called and complained as a customer about how I witnessed him being creepy to her and how it made me uncomfortable. For the most part true lol, I just don't shop there. I took a phone call on my cell when at my desk. Middle manager came up and screamed at me, yelling about how I was not allowed to take calls for clients while at that office. I was a contractor and made it perfectly clear that I did work for multiple clients prior to doing work for this company. The CTO's office was 10 feet from mine. He came out and stood in his doorway listening to the rant. When the middle manager was done I just looked over at the CTO and said, "It's him or me, and at the moment I don't give a freak which you pick." CTO walked the middle manager out right then. Funny thing, I didn't hang up throughout the incident, and it was my wife on the other end. I was spending about 70 hours a week at their site digging their staff out of a hole they had dug themselves in. Not my direct boss, but the new VP of our department. Everyone hated him, and the poorly thought through changes he was threatening to implement. A lot of my co-workers were talking about looking for other jobs. Our manager at the time, my direct boss, was really inexperienced and had no idea how to handle the situation. I was only a year out of college and didn't know what to do. But I was openly gay, as was the VP of a different department. We were the only 2 openly gay people at the company at the time, so we'd chatted a bit. I went to his office and said, "I don't know if you have any influence on my department, but we are going to lose half our team if someone doesn't do something about this guy," and I didn't know who else to come to. He asked me to have anyone else in the department who felt the same way come talk to him. I spread the word, and there were plenty of takers. A few days later, we all saw my department's VP have a private meeting with the CEO. After that meeting he announced that he wasn't going to make the changes he'd been talking about. He then proceeded to do absolutely nothing for the next month, because it turned out that if he couldn't lead the department in a top-down authoritarian style he genuinely didn't know what else to do. He was fired at the end of that month. Apparently, the gay agenda is improving working conditions for everyone. You're welcome. Not me, but my GF at the time. We were both working at a small burrito chain. She was front of house manager, and I was kitchen manager. Above us was one senior manager, and then the owner. We did tip pooling based on hours, and the senior manager always told my GF not to count the tips every night, as he divided it up at the end of the week. Well, of course she counted them every night. Turns out the senior manager was stealing almost $500 a week from employees in tips, and because his previous FOH manager never questioned him, it had likely been going on for years. She told the owners, and he was gone the next day. A week later his wife left him. paranoid, sociopath boss wiretapped all internal phone calls and made life miserable for all who worked in that department. After moving over 1,200 miles to the job location, called wife frequently to discuss the job and family progress in moving there. During those calls, I spun a story about how all of his top managers were plotting against him, which enraged him, and he took out his anger on them. Eventually they went to the company owner and complained, and he was fired the next day.